The obvious theme of the Agamemnon, well, a king decides to go to war to avenge an injustice. So it's about the question of justice. Now, to do it, it turns out that he has to sacrifice his child. This would be easier symbolically, I think, if the child were a boy. Old men decide to go to war, and traditionally it's young men who have to die in the wars that old men decide. So if Agamemnon were sacrificing Orestes instead of Iphigenia, you could say, oh, this is a symbol for what war is always about. It's not a young man, it's a daughter. Now the mother of the child will not forgive him and ends up taking revenge. She apparently doesn't think that the universal principle of justice, in this case, Agamemnon seems to be upset because Paris, the son of Priam of Troy, has come to visit Menelaus. The law of xenia, of guest friendship, demands certain things when, if they didn't have hotels, so you couldn't go stay at a hotel. You had to go stay with a family when you went to a foreign country. So you matched up with a family and you became the guest friend. So Menelaus is the king of Sparta and Paris is the son of the king of Troy. And so naturally, when he goes to Sparta for whatever reason, he stays with the royal family. That has certain obligations. And one of those obligations, although it probably wouldn't be put exactly this way, is that you don't steal the man's wife. So the fact that he goes off with Helen and runs away with Helen, it's not just an erotic question. It is a question of violating these fundamental rules of guest friendship. And Agamemnon apparently thinks that in order to do what he has to do in order to support this fundamental principle, he has to go to war against the Trojans. Now, his wife apparently doesn't think that this universal principle of justice is worth the death of her child. Or you could say, for her, the claims of one's family, outweigh the claims of justice or right as a universal principle as understood by the political order, the city, the polis. Now, this is what the mother in some way stands for in her much more immediate connection to the child. She knows immediately by way of suffering, literally labor, and then birth, that the child to which she gives birth is her own. The relation between them, you could say, is perceptual. The father, forgive the pun, but his connection is conceptual. It's not immediate. It's mediated through the mother. The only way he knows that the child is his is by way of the mother. So at some level, this is the issue of the trilogy, and it turns on this question. The issue of the trilogy is justice, and it turns on this question. Now, the Agamemnon is, of course, a part of a trilogy, the Oresteia. I mentioned last time, it's the only one we have. We noticed on Monday that there are really three strange things about the trilogy. I mentioned to you, some of you have already noticed it. This is not, the plays will get easier to understand. This is perhaps the most difficult play simply to understand on the level of language. The language is lush and thick, but frequently you're not quite sure what's going on. So the trilogy moves from this lush language to much more prosaic language in the last play, in the Eumenides. We notice too that in the Agamemnon, the gods, Hephaestus, Ares, are more or less interchangeable with certain natural phenomena. So Hephaestus with fire, Ares, maybe not natural phenomena, but particular phenomena, Ares with war. The line then at 160, Zeus, whoever he may be, is important. Now, we also remember what happens, or remember because I told you, remember it yourselves when we actually read the plays, but what happens between the second play and the third play is that Orestes is beset by doubts and guilt, and these get characterized as Gorgon-like. He feels he's being pursued by Gorgon-like hags. I don't think he calls them the Furies at that point, but it's clear when we begin the next play and we discover the prophetess at Delphi running out from the temple, describing what she's just seen. And on the one hand, she's seen Orestes with a sword, all bloody. And on the other hand, she's seen these 12 Gorgon-like hags who have, for some reason, fallen asleep. No, it doesn't count as sexual taboo. That's not the issue. Agamemnon never characterizes it that way. It gets characterized as violating a fundamental law. It's the violation of the law of guest friendship that is absolutely necessary, they think, for civilizations to continue to exist. So it doesn't, we might interpret it differently. We may interpret it differently, but to begin with, it's not that. To begin with, Paris does something awful because he does something so utterly antisocial that if it were to stand, it would mean that cities were in a perennial state of war with one another, that there's no way in which they could interact peacefully. So Menelaus may understand it the way you understand it, and the relation between Menelaus and Agamemnon, that's an interesting relation. Why does Agamemnon take up this cause? But insofar as it's justified, it gets justified explicitly as punishment for the violation of a law. Now, we don't have to buy that. I mean, it may in the end turn out to be something very different, but right now, you start with what they say that it's about, and he presents it as though that's the issue. So, and then the third strange thing was the prominence of this word, decay, justice, but more specifically, the prominence of this use of it in the accusative case to mean like or in the manner of, which introduced the question of likeness or images. And we noticed, again, I noticed and I told you, and therefore you noticed, that this use of decain occurs more in the Agamemnon than in all of the rest of Greek literature combined. So the question that we sort of concluded with last time was this: what might connect justice, the question of justice, the obvious issue of the trilogy, to the question of likenesses or images or poetry? And how might this in turn be connected to the transformation of the language, Agamemnon to Eumenides, lush to plain, and to how we understand the gods? So we'll pick it up there in a minute, but first, some helpful terms. These come directly out of chapter 12 of the Poetics. So if you want to look for them, they're there. Just for dividing up a tragedy so we know where we are. The part of the play called the prologue comes first. This is a speech or a dialogue between two characters that occurs prior to the entrance of the chorus. Then the parados. That's the ode that the chorus sing while they enter. And then episode, which is the dialogue among characters, sometimes characters and the chorus, that occurs between choral odes. Choral odes are called stasima, singular stasimon. That's a choral ode that's sung not while entering or leaving, but while in place. An exodus is what follows after the last stasimon. A comus is a choral lamentation and answers from a character on stage, which is placed in the drama in place of a choral ode or stasimon. Now finally, the odes are divided into what are called strophes and antistrophes, where the chorus splits. One part represents, one part makes a statement, the strophe, the antistrophe ordinarily responds to it. So while it's not always adhered to, the meter of the antistrophe usually duplicates the meter of the strophe. So what we'll notice, sometimes there'll be so if two words occur, one in the strophe and one in the antistrophe, and the one in the antistrophe corresponds metrically exactly to the one in the strophe, it's sometimes interesting to compare them. And if there's a variation in the meter, that can often be intentional as well. I want to do that just because I'm going to use those terms today, so I didn't want to just spring them on you. So let's turn to the Agamemnon. It starts with a prologue, with the guard, with the watchman. So why does it start that way? Everything he says, the guard, the watchman, could have been reported by the chorus or by Clytemnestra. And Aeschylus very frequently does it that way. So for example, in the Suppliant Maidens and in the Persians, he opens both with the chorus. Now, this prologue roughly divides in two. So lines 1 through 20, the watchman describes how bored he is because of the unchanging cyclical nature of the heavens that he's constantly forced to look at. He's standing on top of the house. He has to sing to keep himself awake. The second half, lines 21 through 38, he discovers the signal fire. So he's in an interesting position. He's on top of the house, looking up at various constellations. He calls them, on line 6, potentates or dynasts, probably more literally. And those who bring winter and summer to mortals, the bright potentates shining in the sky. He's looking down on the house of Atreus, who is Agamemnon's father. So the prologue presents us with the image of a problem. You could say, how's it possible to put together the universality and unchangingness characteristic of the heavens with the particularity and change that's characteristic of human affairs? It may be the house of Atreus, but Atreus isn't living in it any longer. It's now the house of Agamemnon, and he's not even living in it at the moment. Now, if you think about it for a minute, I mean, we're jumping the gun, but that's okay. This really is just the problem of justice. The eternal order of things is indifferent to the human. The watchman's bored. And the human, what doesn't bore, our own experience, is something from which we cannot be detached. So justice strangely requires that we, on the one hand, be interested in how things turn out without sacrificing the detachment that's supposedly necessary to make the judgment about what's just. Or put it this way, justice requires fairness, but to be fair means detached observation, means looking at things in terms of timeless standards. The alternative to that would be something like vengeance, something like the Oresteia. But human beings aren't detached. Think about what the chorus are just about to say, pathe mathos. We learn through suffering. Knowledge requires suffering. You've got to be an interested party in order to actually take, in order to have a motive to look at things. Or put it still differently, you could say, you put it this way, what a strange thing it is. If I ask you, name to me your most powerful experience of justice, it's kind of interesting that almost all of you are going to reply by telling me about an injustice that's been rectified. That's what the experience of justice is. If things always work the way they were supposed to, they would sort of pass by us and we sort of take it for granted. Things would all fall into place as they ought and it wouldn't startle you at all. No, the experience of justice has to do with, that's not fair. You can't do that to me, which of course you only say when someone has just done it to you, which is a little odd. But the experience of you can't do that to me is our fundamental experience of justice, but it's impossible unless justice has been broken in some way. So it turns out to be the case that you put it in this way. If the fundamental experience of justice is one of injustice, such experiences are always suspect. The injured party inevitably tends to overestimate their injury. And yet, justice is really only of interest, finally, to those who are injured. So how's it possible? How is justice possible? Or put it still differently, justice always gets understood in the following way. Just as X did Y, I will do Z. But this just as is our adverbial decane. There's something irreducibly poetic about this experience of justice. You can see that in a very simple way. Classic statement of the problem of justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's supposed to make the claim that when a bad thing is done, it gets repaid with exactly the same thing. But the eye that is lost is never the same as the eye that is taken in order to right the wrong. The tooth isn't the same tooth. It's like it. Or another example, even if it were the same, this is going to come up in the Electra story. It comes up more powerfully in Sophocles' Electra story than it does in the libation bearers. But you can put the problem in this way. The reason it shows up in Electra is that Electra, Orestes, of course, is sent away and then comes back and renders justice. or vengeance. Electra's there in the household the whole time while waiting for Agamemnon to come home and then waiting for somebody to come back and help her avenge the death of her father. So the difficulty is, how to put it? Forget about Electra. An eye for an eye. So somebody pokes your eye out, and then the law in its judgment decides, well, if you poked her eye out, we're going to poke your eye out. That's literally an eye for an eye, right? The difficulty is that it's not only that you got your eye poked out, but you have to live with it. You have to live with the fact that this injustice has been done to you. Not only the fact that you can now only see out of one eye and presumably don't have depth perception, but just thinking about what's been done to you, mulling it over, resenting it, all of that hurt is part of the injury, and the longer it goes on, presumably, the more it has to be accounted for. So if justice consisted of simply doing the same injury to the person who did the initial injury, in a way it wouldn't be enough, because it doesn't account for all the suffering that's going on in between. So the difficulty is, of course, that's very hard to calculate what on earth that would mean, adding, well, not just the pain of getting your eye poked out, but also the suffering that comes. We're going to account for that. We're going to account for that as well. The problem is that it looks as though the only way you could really do justice would be for the injustice to be punished immediately, at the very moment it was done. But of course, that would be to forestall it. That's not possible. It's not possible for it. There's always some sort of time interval between the bad thing that was done and the punishment for the bad thing. And that time interval is, in a way, the problem that shows you that perfect justice looks as though it's out of the question, because in order for perfect justice to occur, if the gods rendered it, the gods would have to prevent the thing from happening in the first place. Therefore, the Hagar cartoon, right? So that, what does he say? He's talking to his son. Has anybody got it there? Can anybody read it to me? I have it somewhere. Cartoons are wonderful philosophical instruments. So he's talking to his son. His son's name is Hamlet, which is interesting. Son, it's wrong to waste your whole life trying to get even. Always try to get even as soon as it happens. That's his version of this problem of perfect justice. Okay, let's see how this issue emerges in the Parados. Now, this runs for 216 lines from 40 to 256. It's one of the most beautiful choral odes in Greek tragedy, divides into 5 parts. First part, lines 40 through 82. 12 old men who didn't go to Troy because of their age begin an account of the war. So if you look on your page 30, I think we have the same pages, it's line 41. Somebody tell me if they've changed the text. Top of the page, where, let's go back to the last line on page 29. It is now the 10th year since Priam's great adversary, literally in Greek, Antidikos, at law, Menelaus and Menelaus Lord, and with him Agamemnon. Now, Antidikos, literally a returner of right, or since right can mean punishment, a returner of punishment. You have adversary at law. It's singular. There are 2 of them, though, Menelaus and Agamemnon. and they're called punishers. They're mentioned immediately after this term, antidikos. So there's one antidikos, because it's singular, and there are two punishers, which means that those suffering in this case are not the same as those punishing. Or you could say, comes back to the question you raised, in this very subtle way, Aeschylus has shown that we need to ask about Agamemnon's motive. What's he doing this for? Yes, Menelaus is his brother, but it didn't happen to him. The problem is compounded by where it goes after this. The pair of sons of Atreus, mighty in honor, put out with an Argive armament of 1,000 ships from this land to aid their cause in battle, uttering from their hearts a great cry for war, like literally eagles who in grief extreme for their children high above their beds circle round, rode on the oarage of their wings, having seen go for nothing the labor of guarding the bed that held their chicks. So we're given an analogy. Apparently, Agamemnon and Menelaus stand to Helen as eagles or vultures stand to what? Their chicks? The youth? Their babies? So the parental bond is what justifies their action being comparable to what Agamemnon and Menelaus do, namely they mount a war and bring 1,000 ships to Troy. This is a strange likeness. It is, the word is used here, decain. It's a very strange likeness, given what Agamemnon will do to Iphigenia in order to get this war moving. So he's done a very strange thing. He's saying, oh, these two guys are just like eagles who are avenging the loss of their children. So what does Agamemnon do in order to avenge the loss of his brother's wife, who is being likened to a child? He kills his daughter. So we know we're not sure what's going on. Aeschylus is surely aware of what a strange image he's given us. In part 2 of the chorus, 83 through 103, what has happened, Clytemnestra, that you offer sacrifices? So they notice that there are sacrifices going around all over the city. They see that something is up. They want to know what it is. They're not talking to her. They are addressing her, but she's not present at the moment. And then we get part 3. We get a thing that happens that they all see, a portent, and then the seer Calchas interpretations of what happened. So let's look on page 34 for that, about line 114. The king of birds appearing to the king of the ships, the black eagle, and behind it the white one, appearing near the palace on the hand in which the spear is brandished, the right hand. In seats conspicuous, feeding upon the hare, her womb teeming with young, checked from running her final course, sing sorrow, sorrow, but may the good prevail. So they see 2 eagles attacking a pregnant rabbit. That's what they all see. And then, that's what actually happens. And then Calchas interprets it. And the interpretation will be what? That Artemis, the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, is angry. We get that on page 35. at line 133. Only let no envy from the gods cast into darkness struck beforehand the great bit for Troy's mouth, that is the army encamped. For in pity, holy Artemis is angry with the swift hounds of her father that sacrificed the wretched hare with all her young before the birth. She loathes the feast of the eagles. Sing sorrow, sorrow, but may the good prevail. Notice that this is the part of the antistrophe that corresponds to the part I just read in the strophe. You see what a strange thing it is, though, because this is still on the level of the image. So they see the eagles go after the hare, and then Calchas says, well, you know why Artemis is angry? Because the eagles went after the hare, but that's only, so why is she angry at Agamemnon and Menelaus? They're not really the eagles. It's only once it's interpreted that they stand for the eagles, I'm sorry, the other way around, that the eagles stand for them, that you can understand this as an account of why Artemis should be angry at them. It's still on the level of the image, and the interesting thing is that we never, ever get a non-metaphorical account of why Artemis is angry. That's rather important, given that that's the reason why Agamemnon kills his daughter. Her anger is the cause for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. So the good prevail has nothing at all to do with our experience of right triumphing, because why the gods do what they do is presented as a total mystery to us. And therefore, part 4 of the chorus begins with a statement of our ignorance of who Zeus is. On page 36 at the bottom, line 160, whoever Zeus may be, if this name is pleasing to him, by this name I address him. So we know Zeus. They go on to describe this in the antistrophe. We know Zeus overthrew his father, Kronos, although not why. We know also that Kronos overthrew his father, Ouranos. Since the ways of Zeus are inscrutable to us, we can only learn by way of experience or suffering, pathemathos. On page 38, we get that finally. Of Zeus who put men on the way to wisdom by making it a valid law that by suffering they shall learn, pathemathos. That's important to, this is a little digression, a little parenthetical remark. This word pathos comes from the verb paskein, which means on the one hand to undergo or experience something, and on the other hand, really to suffer. So it means to begin with something that looks as though we're just talking about active and passive. There's an action, I hit. There's a passion or receiving, I am hit. So passive, active and passive verbs in a way look as though that's really the meaning of paskein and pathos. It just means undergoing, receiving an action, but then it really means suffering. There's an old, you can talk about, I will suffer you to do that. It's sort of almost archaic English now, but it means I'll allow you to do that. But for us, and even for them, suffering has a tougher meaning than that. It means something harsher. It means actually undergoing things that are painful. So the assumption is somehow that when we move through the world and meet resistance, we experience things by virtue of the fact that we meet resistance. And on the one hand, you don't get any knowledge or experience or sense of what the world's like without that. And on the other hand, meeting resistance is an obstacle to your freedom. It It hurts, interestingly enough, but without that hurt, you don't know anything. So pathos has this double meaning. It's not just an accident of the language, but it's actually, it has a very deep philosophical significance about what it means that we live in a world where in order to undergo anything, we have to run, it has to run into us. We have to be hit. I'm struck by that, we say. Yeah, that sounds right. I'm struck by that. And we use that kind of language all the time, but to be struck by something is actually, if you use it in another way, it means to be hurt by something. So, Zeus's justice is not experienced by us as justice. That's what it means that we don't know who he is. There are a lot of parallels. You should think about the parallels between this story, the story of Iphigenia, and the story of Abraham and Isaac. Finally, part 5, lines 184 to 257, they describe Iphigenia's sacrifice. This is, in a way, one of my favorite parts of this play, the early part of the play anyway. So they describe how Agamemnon first didn't want to do it, and then finally he gave in. And then there's something peculiar at line 248 through 249. We're now on page 42, where we get this. And what came next, I did not see, nor do I relate it, but the arts of Calchas do not fail of fulfillment, and justice sways the balance, bringing to some learning by suffering. What is it that they're talking about? What came next they didn't see? They averted their eyes? Yeah, so what's interesting about that? Where were they? I mean, up until now, it could have been, telling the story that they'd heard, but perfectly plausibly. Could be a secondhand account. This is what happened. But at a certain point, they say, now I couldn't look. Well, what does that mean? Where are they? Where does the sacrifice take place? I'm sorry? I didn't hear. Publicly. But where in particular? I'm thinking place. Aulis. Iphigenia at Aulis. That's the play that's written about it. Aulis is 200 miles away from where they are. That's where the ships stole, right? Where Agamemnon, you've collected 1,000 ships, you're supposed to be going off to Troy, and the winds keep pushing back, and the gods must be opposed to this, and so that's why he presses Calchas, and Calchas says, well, remember those eagles? Artemis is mad. In order to get her happy, you're going to have to sacrifice Iphigenia, and Agamemnon says, I can't do that. And then gradually he says, well, actually, I could do that. Maybe I will do that. And then he sacrifices her, and then the wind clears up, and they go to Troy, and it takes 10 years, but they beat the Trojans, right? But they're at Aulis. The 1,000 ships aren't just from Argos, they're from all over Greece. So they've met at Aulis, and then now they're stuck with no winds to carry them. So the chorus, remember who they are? Who are they? They're 12 old men who couldn't go to Troy because they're too old, right? So, and that was 10 years ago. So how come they're, right, good point. What are they doing there? Why are they there? Well, think about it this way. Agamemnon went off to Aulis with his ships. Now, did he say to himself, I think I'll take Iphigenia along just in case we need to sacrifice her? Or what? He had to send for her, right? But you don't send a little girl from Argos to Aulis all by herself. Who's left in Argos? Well, these old guys who didn't go because they were too old. They couldn't go to war. It doesn't mean they couldn't go to Aulis. Now, none of this is said by any of the characters or by Aeschylus, but let's just try it as a hypothesis. Suppose they escorted her to Aulus. What does that mean about them? How have they been presenting themselves so far? This is the chorus. We're getting an objective report from the chorus who says, but wait, they took her to Aulus? They're in it up to their necks. They're complicit in this action, but they're hiding the fact that they're complicit. Does that remind us of anything? Yeah. It reminds us of, on the one hand, the objectivity that's required and detachment that's required for justice, and on the other hand, the fact that none of us are detached in that way, and therefore we have in front of us a chorus which has a concealed motive. They're terribly ashamed of what they did, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're presenting themselves as though they're utterly detached and it doesn't have anything to do with them. You had a question?
Oh, no.
Okay. So, what's the point? They hide their complicity in order to pretend to a kind of objectivity. They're ashamed. Their knowledge comes from suffering, from being involved. This whole issue comes up again in the exchange between Clytemnestra and the chorus that we get in the first episode. So that's 257 to 354. First, Clytemnestra tells them the reason the sacrifices are all over the place and all the temples is that Troy has fallen, and naturally they're curious and ask her how she knows. So she gives them two accounts. In lines 281 through 316, she tells them about the signal fires. So it starts on Mount Ida in Asia Minor, and so from mountaintop to mountaintop and mountaintop, she names all of them. They light a fire. This is apparently prearranged. When Agamemnon went off, they light a fire, and then speed of light is very fast, so it's really instantaneous. And then at the next mountain, there's somebody stationed who lights a fire, another fire, and finally they see it after about 6 fires in Argos. She gives them this very, very plausible account, and they say, well, I guess, but I'm not so sure. So on page 46, you get this, where they say at the end, to the gods, lady, I shall address my prayer later, but for this tale of yours, I would hear it to the end again and exhaust my wonder at it. So they're not convinced. Then what does she do? In the sequel, she gives them a long, rather long, invented poetic account about what is happening to everybody at Troy. So, for example, on 47 at line 325 following, you get this: for the conquered falling about the bodies of men, brothers and fathers of children and aged men, from a throat no longer free lament the end of their dear ones. Now they believe her. She started by giving it perfectly what you might call a rational scientific account of how they know. And they say, yeah, well, maybe, but I don't really buy it. And then she says, how else do you know? And she gives them a description of something she can't possibly know. She's just invented all the suffering that's going on at Troy and all the and the fate of the Greeks who are imposing that suffering. So on page 48, you get this. The chorus say, lady, you speak wisely, like a prudent man, and now that I have heard from you sure proofs, I make ready to address in praise the gods, for not unworthy of our labors is the return they have accomplished. Notice, by the way, 351, this turns out to be rather important. Literally, woman, you speak prudently in the way of a moderate man. If you go back to line 10 on page 28, almost at the very beginning, the night watchman had said this, for such is the rule of a woman's man counseling. Literally, thus rules the heart of a woman being of manly counsel. We'll come back to that a lot, but right now, Clytemnestra gives them a fake experience, a poetic experience, and they accept it. The scientific account wasn't persuasive. So apparently, what they and we find persuasive is on the level of suffering, of experience, even though the experience is not true. However, the truth seems to require that we in some way transcend this level. Now, the consequence of all this becomes clearer in the second Stasimon, 355 to 487. And then, following that, in the second episode, when the herald comes in to announce Agamemnon's arrival at 489 through 680, and then in the third Stasimon, line 681 to 781. So the chorus expressed the view that the victory at Troy is an example of Zeus punishing injustice, of what Paris, who is also called Alexandre, so you'll notice that, of what Paris did. The herald comes in and confirms this. But then gradually, by the time he's finished his rather long speech, he reveals to us that all of the Argive ships that went to Troy under the command of Agamemnon, there were 100 of them, the Iliad tells us. Of all of them, the only one that returns is Agamemnon's. The rest have been sunk in a storm. So the chorus began with the expression that this victory is a victory for justice. The herald starts by saying that, but if that's true, and 99 of the Argive ships were sunk, does that mean that they also were punished by Zeus? So what's going on? On page 49, I'm going to read a rather long section. It is the mighty Zeus, Lord of host and guest, that I revere, he that has accomplished this against Alexandre or Paris. Long since he has been bending his bow, so that neither short of the mark nor beyond it should the bolt of the stars fall vainly. They may speak of a stroke from Zeus. That at least can be traced out. He has accomplished it, as he ordained. Men have said that the gods did not deign to attend to mortals by whom the grace of things inviolable was trampled. But such men are impious, and the penalty for daring what may not be dared has been revealed to the descendants of those whose pride is greater than is right. Remember that, to the descendants of those. When their house abounds with wealth and excess beyond what is best, may it be granted me to have good sense so that the gods are content to leave me free from harm. For there is no defense for a man who in the surfeit of his wealth has kicked the great altar of justice out of sight. Now, so what's the problem of justice? You read, say, the Old Testament, and you see many harsh things done, but you could argue that things even out over time. And yet, no character in the story experiences this evening out. Even here, we get an account that says, and the penalty for daring what may not be dared has been revealed to the descendants of those whose pride is greater than is right. That means not to the people who did it, but to the people to whom they gave birth. So, in order to experience this evening out, You have to imagine it. Now, similarly, in the Oresteia, the story, one way of interpreting it is that in the long run, the evil are punished for their evilness. So the Agamemnon tells us a story of the death of Agamemnon, presumably for the killing of Iphigenia. But it's not just the death of Agamemnon, there's always a little added business, and along with his death is the death of Cassandra. But the libation bearers tells us that the death of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, it tells us of the death of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, who were the killers of Agamemnon and Cassandra. Now, the chorus here make precisely this claim about justice. Things even out over time. What they claim in general to be true, though, they have no experience of in particular. It's really important to remember that the chorus of the Agamemnon is not the same as the chorus of the libation bearers. So it'd be one thing if you had these 12 old men in the Agamemnon and then they were witnesses to what happened in the libation bearers, but they're probably dead by the time the libation bearers starts. So there's no experience of the evening out, and the evening out is precisely what justice is supposed to be. Even in the Eumenides, where it looks as though justice gets established when law takes the place of vengeance or vendetta, the jury tries Orestes and splits down the middle. So they don't all experience the same thing. Half of them think that he's innocent and half of them think that he's guilty. The pattern of justice, of decay, of right, is known to whom then? The only location of an awareness of this pattern of justice is in the audience who hears the whole story. You. So, question, is it possible ever to experience justice or right having been done? It looks as though it's only if it's pushed beyond experience. The chorus pretty clearly tells us at lines 475 through 78 that they won't believe anything but what they see. So the problem with that is that they'll never see justice. So it looks as though justice, right, decay, is necessarily connected to decaying, just as, and in two ways. We experience justice naturally in this way by setting up an analogy. The analogy leads to something like vengeance. So once again, an eye for an eye is never simply an identity, but always has the form, this is just like that, which it can never be. And this natural connection between justice and image making suggests the possibility of a series of likenesses, of analogies, that detach you from the immediacy of the situation while somehow preserving the immediacy of the situation. So you could say, Aeschylus is slowly making a powerful point about how deeply justice is connected to poetry. Remember Clytemnestra's second account. And finally to tragedy. And that's where the Oresteia is headed. It's taking us to think through the necessity and the character of this connection between poetry on the one hand and justice on the other hand, and especially the connection between a certain kind of poetry and our experience of justice. So it's making an extraordinary claim for the importance of tragedy. it will turn out that the crime that's really at the center of this whole trilogy, literally at the center in the libation bearers, but in many more ways than that. You'll notice, for example, that there's only one character that cuts across all three plays. This is Clytemnestra's trilogy. We haven't seen that yet, but she's the central character really in this. And in the next play, and she appears in a dream in the third play. So the death of the mother, the killing of the mother, that's somehow crucial for what Aeschylus has in mind. What's interesting is that the traditional story about the founding of about the Areopagus, why it becomes, it's called the Hill of Ares, Areopagus. Why? Because that's where Ares was tried, and not by Athenians, but by the gods. So it becomes a place of trial because something that happened, an entirely different myth. Aeschylus chucks that myth. It still happens on the Areopagus, but now we're talking about the founding of the Athenian legal system, and that has something to do with the legal status of matricide. That's a peek ahead. I'm kind of finished, and that leaves you a lot of time to ask stuff, if you want to ask stuff. Atreus finds out that Thyestes is sleeping with his wife. So he arranges for a dinner where he feeds. So that's the adultery problem. It's not a murder problem. So he kills all the children but one and feeds them to Thyestes, who discovers what happened. And that's why Aeschylus comes back and seduces, let's not say seduces, Clytemnestra is too good for that. I mean, she sort of knows what she's doing. But he sleeps with Clytemnestra while she's still married to Agamemnon. And then when Agamemnon comes home, he and she together, depending on which account, kill Agamemnon. So that looks as though it's a killing for those prior killings, right? And now it turns out that Orestes is outraged because his mother has killed his father. So he comes back and kills them, and presumably this could go on endlessly. So it turns out that the Eumenides is how you put it, is an account of how you can put a stop to it. It looks as though the reason it goes on endlessly has something to do with decane. Just as the difficulty is, if you were talking about identities, A happened, therefore A in return, but it's not A in return, it's A prime. And A prime always adds a little extra something. And when a little extra something is added, like Cassandra, then it turns out that there's another reason. Since there was no identity, people can't just say, well, that settles it. It's done. There is no identity. There's a likeness, and therefore there's always a remainder, something left over that has to be taken care of, and then the next generation takes care of that, and it goes on endlessly precisely because there's no equality. The law steps in and says, we will declare equality. We'll figure this out, and we're going to stop this vendetta that runs. And the interesting thing about the Eumenides, as we'll see, is this is a wonderful invention. I mean, it's a splendid celebration of the importance of law on the one hand, but Aeschylus is no dummy. And he sees that even there, it's very, very problematic. And it turns out to be problematic because there's a big difference between guilt and guilt. Between I declare you guilty in a court and you feel guilty. No guarantee that somebody's going to feel guilty just because they're declared guilty, and genuine justice would require that they felt bad for what they had done, really bad for what they had done. So it's an improvement, but he's no fool. He sees that it's not a complete solution. So Athena has to figure out what to do with the Furies, and we'll see all of that when we get there. But I think that the interesting thing is, once you begin to stretch it out in time, you see that it's almost because of the outrage, of the interestedness, that the punishment can't fit the crime and justice can't be done on the one hand, and on the other hand, there wouldn't be any punishment at all unless someone were outraged. So it looks like you've got to somehow square that circle. That's what Aeschylus is dealing with. It needs to be the case that the anger that motivates justice not be altogether dissipated on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got to find a way that around the fact that anger, once aroused, is not really objective. This is not a recurring problem in Greek tragedy. Remember my drawing on the board, the Oedipus, the three ways he hovers above. He strives for a kind of objectivity, a total objectivity. And yet, what we'll notice when we read that play is this is a man who is consumed by anger. So in his own way, Sophocles asks the question, what's the connection between anger and objectivity? It's when we're most angry when we tend to presume that we occupy an objective point of view. Just think about, I don't know where you get angry. I don't get angry anymore, but I used to get angry. And one of the places, it must be because of the pounding of the water, but we all rehearse at some point the various slights that have been done to us over the course of the week. And for me, it's always in the shower when that comes to. But it's interesting, you start with a very specific thing that's happened to you, and you're upset by it. So you have a fight with not yours, but my wife, say, and it starts off by saying something like, that was so nasty. And then pretty soon you're up to, she always does that to me. And then that gets general. The tendency of anger to generalize and turn a very specific hurt into behavior that's characteristic. And why does she always do that? That's anger at work. And that's the connection between anger and generalizing. And it's the form that our initial feelings of justice and fairness tend to take. And that's the problem that Aeschylus is grappling with. Because you don't have justice without something like that anger. You don't have the motive for justice. A god might be able to do it, but that's just another way of saying we don't know how it's done. I mean, for us, it has to piss you off when something bad happens, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that almost guarantees that you're going to get it wrong. You're not going to understand it because you're not going to be able to have the requisite detachment to be able to think it through from the other side. One has to think about that. That's important. But you also have to think about the very last move that you made. If it were simply fear, he wouldn't necessarily appoint himself the vehicle for seeking justice. He's taking it upon himself to act in Zeus's stead, you could say. So there's something else that gets added in. Otherwise, if it were simply fear, you could kind of run away or tremble or say, oh my God, this will happen again, and then the whole world will fall apart. But there's nothing there that requires that you organize all of Greece and gather 1,000 ships together and sail off to Troy and fight a 10-year war. I mean, part of what's going on there is, admittedly, this man wants the glory of having done that, of having taken up Zeus's cause. So it's complicated, but having all that said, I think you're right, that you need to think about, I mean, in a way, you could put it in this way. If we weren't vulnerable, then we wouldn't get angry. An all-powerful being, presumably, wouldn't have to get angry, you just swat away it would be like a pesky fly trying to. So the fact that you get so angry, we all know that too, in your own shower episodes, that you don't go over and over and over this stuff unless it points to a kind of vulnerability that you would prefer that you didn't have. This exposes your vulnerability, and you hate that. And knowing that you're vulnerable in that way is a version of what you described as fear. So I think, this is early days, but we need to keep in mind what you said. It's also interesting that when the chorus say at the beginning of part 4, Zeus, whoever he is and whatever he wants to be called, it's an indication that they don't really claim to know what Zeus is or wants them to do. And then we're confronted by various things that are understood to be caused by the gods, but they don't look as though they're necessarily, and we know that from the Iliad, of course, don't look as though they're all aiming at the same thing. And so it looks as though we're constantly, that's why you need Calchas, because you don't have any idea what the gods want you to do. So you're forced into this situation where you have to interpret this poetry in order to figure out these images, natural images, in order to figure out what the gods want you to do. And it's extremely, that's why I think Aeschylus has set it up in this quite beautiful way, where he says, this is what they all saw, the eagles gutting the pregnant hare. And Artemis was mad at that, and therefore she punished them. How bizarre, just think about that for a minute. How bizarre is that? So this happened. The eagles went down and they tore up this pregnant hare. You could say that's a terrible thing. But you have to identify the eagles with Agamemnon and Menelaus before you are willing to say that that's the reason why the winds have failed and they can't go to Troy. But why should it's an image, and everything occurs on the level of the image, and you never get past that. It's not, you can't point to anything that Menelaus and Agamemnon actually did that makes her so angry at them. And the play gives you no help whatsoever. It's an absolute mystery why they should be stalled at Aulis. That's really very beautiful. That's a beautiful depiction of the situation human beings are in vis-a-vis the gods. They give an account of all these events that lead up to the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And when they give the account, you have no idea whether they're witnesses or whether they're getting it secondhand. You don't know. It's perfectly plausible that somebody came back and said, this is what happened. Clytemnestra, your daughter isn't coming back, and she's not coming back because she's dead because they had to go to Troy. So when they're giving the account, you don't know where they're getting it from, except at that moment when they say, and now we had to turn aside. We could no longer look, which means they were there. But they had identified them in the very beginning. They had identified themselves in the very beginning of part 1 as too old to have gone to Troy. So They're too old to have gone with Troy. This is, by the way, not an absolutely foolproof argument, but it doesn't have to be. All it has to do is get you thinking that this might have been the case. Well, what might have been the case? Agamemnon discovers he has to sacrifice Iphigenia. For that to happen, he needs Iphigenia. For that to happen, she can't be in Argos, she has to be in Aulis. So she has to get from Argos to Aulis. So when you start thinking about it, somebody's got to take her there. So you ask, well, why are these 12 old men now in Aulis when they were in Argos? Well, they're in Aulis because somebody had to take Iphigenia. They did that. So they're systematically suppressing the fact that they did that. That's why it's not mentioned. They're suppressing the fact that they did it because they know that it involves them in an action that they don't want to be involved in. They're ashamed of the fact of what they did and therefore suppress it. And Aeschylus has just beautifully, you're not allowed to say, oh, that happened. What you're allowed to say is, oh, did that happen? But that's enough, because as soon as you say, did that happen, you realize that the whole point is to call into question the detachment and objectivity of these 12 old men who are presenting themselves as though they didn't have anything to do with it, when in fact there's a very good chance that they had everything to do with it. You can make a case for Artemis's anger, right? But you have to make the case. Aeschylus doesn't do it for you. Nowhere is it said. Why? And not to mention the fact that if she was angry, it's very unclear why the sacrifice of Iphigenia would be required in order to now Agamemnon is forgiven and he can go off and 10 years later sack her beloved Troy. So it's complicated under any circumstances. You don't really understand. When you're confronted in a book like this, true of, say, Platonic dialogues as well, you're beating your head against the wall and you're confronted with a problem that looks terribly important to you, but you just can't solve it. Sometimes it's good to step back and ask yourself the question, maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is it's terribly important and I just can't solve it. And that inability to solve it turns out to be what you're supposed to learn, what you need to plug in order to understand what's happening. So it looks as though, if you put yourself psychologically in Agamemnon's situation, he's got to believe that Artemis is angry and that this symbol of the hair and the legals is the reason for her anger. And maybe we can figure, but he certainly doesn't know yet that Artemis is opposed to the Trojan Wars. So he's got to be very puzzled about why he needs to kill his daughter to appease her anger. But in fact, it looks as though, that's why I suggested the comparison to Abraham and Isaac. In the end, it's really not clear that he can know. You can create a case, and I think that's a plausible way to begin thinking about it if you were to do that. But the fact that you have to make the case, you're just Agamemnon. Agamemnon's sitting there scratching his head and saying, well, maybe Artemis, because she's the goddess of, maybe she wants Iphigenia for that reason, or maybe she really is in favor of the Trojans, so she doesn't want us to sail, and so we have to pay a heavy price, but why it should be my daughter, I'm not. You see, you're in exactly the situation that Agamemnon's in, trying to figure this out from what looks like it's very insufficient evidence, because all you get is this metaphor. And it's perfectly reasonable for you to want to do that, but the fact that you want to do that is precisely a sign of what's lacking here. Calchas, the seer, who along with the rest of them witnesses this strange thing happening in the sky, and you turn to the seer to say, what does that mean? So the seer is like a literary critic. You need somebody to interpret and interpret these signs.